The 1966 version of War and Peace is one of the most astounding films ever made. When you hear the words epic, this is the type of film you think about. Even calling the film epic hardly does it justice. The scale of the production is beyond impressive and eclipses anything that came before it. Hardly any films have been able to match it since then, and the spectacle of its battle sequences is something that never has and never will be topped. Made at the peak of the Soviet film industry with the full backing of the Soviet government, this gigantic 7-hour-long film aimed to bring to life the epic story of War and Peace, written by celebrated Russian author Leo Tolstoy. It was so enormous that it had to be split into 4 parts to even make it palpable to audiences. War and Peace was made in response to the influx of American films making their way into the Soviet Union, and was also to show the world that the Soviet Union had what it took to not only compete with the American film industry, but to show them that they could transcend American film production. They certainly succeeded, but to understand how one of cinema's greatest achievements was made, we have to go all the way back to March 5th, 1953, with the death of Joseph Stalin. Since Stalin seized power in Russia in the 1920s, his iron grip over the Soviet Union never loosened. On the contrary, it only got stronger as time went on. With his power being absolute, anyone who dared question him felt his fiery wrath. Stalin's grip extended into every facet of the Soviet Union, and the film industry was no exception. Even after World War II's conclusion, Stalin's censorship never relaxed. It actually only got worse, and he often personally took to censoring films or changing things he didn't like. Many Soviet directors dreaded being called upon to make a film for Stalin, only to have their films be butchered and censored to suit him and his cult of personality. A notable example of Stalin's impact can be seen in The Fall of Berlin from 1950, where minutes after Berlin falls, Stalin flies into the city to be eagerly greeted by people from all nations celebrating his arrival. Stalin then calls for world peace and wishes happiness on everyone.
Мира и счастья!
That's just one of the more insane and unhinged moments from the film that's over 2.5 hours long. This would all change with the death of Stalin and the subsequent rise of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev went on a campaign of de-Stalinization and denounced Stalin's cult of personality. Khrushchev's campaign allowed for more freedom in the creative arts along with a relaxation in censorship for the Soviet film industry. Due to these changes, the Soviet film industry started to be more open and creative with its projects. The number of films being made drastically increased in the late 50s, as the Soviet government started supporting the domestic film industry more. The starved Soviet audiences had an enormous appetite, and they were more than eager to support anything new. The Soviet cinema goer had been rather limited in choice for what they could watch under Stalin, but now that Khrushchev was in power, they had a lot more choice, not only in Russian films, but Western films as well. Khrushchev was interested in the idea of cultural exchange with the West as a form of soft power in an effort to show the USSR as an equal, if not better, than their Western contemporaries. With these cultural exchanges came transfer of films. The United States of America began sending films to the Soviet Union, and one of the first films they sent was the 1956 Italian-American co-production of War and Peace. Directed by King Vidor and starring Henry Fonda and Audrey Hepburn, it turned out to be a massive hit in Russia when it released in 1959. Attracting over 30 million viewers, some audience goers would criticize the film for leaving out many smaller scenes, changing dialogue, and creating entirely new lines. It was also criticized for its poor historical accuracy. I mean, just look at this scene that's supposed to be the Peace of Tilsit. The location doesn't look anything like the real location. While the film isn't the best in terms of its historical accuracy or accuracy to the original novel, the general reception was positive, mainly because they were infatuated with Audrey Hepburn as Natasha. America sent War and Peace to the Soviet Union over other alternatives, as America wanted to show the Soviets that they had the power and the industry to make a sweeping and glamorous epic based on Russian history and literature. While Russia had previously made 5 films based on War and Peace, they were all made before the Revolution and the sound era of film. They were nowhere near the level of the 1956 version. With the challenge from the Americans and the threat to national pride, the lack of any real Russian version of War and Peace, combined with the rapid rise of the Soviet film industry in the 50s, it created a perfect storm to shape a new Russian version of War and Peace. By the 1960s, the Soviet government had constantly been pestered by not only the public, but also artists, directors, and people of prominence in Russia, demanding their own version of War and Peace. Those voices only grew, practically begging the Soviet government to not only protect the nation's honor, but the honor of what is widely considered Russia's greatest piece of literature. The demands finally reached a breaking point when in 1960, the Soviet Minister of Culture, Ekaterina Ferdstova, approved plans to make a Russian version of War and Peace, one that would top the Italian-American version in every possible way and show the world that Russia could compete with, if not surpass, anything that Hollywood, and by extension America, could ever hope to produce. The Soviet government would commission Mosfilm for the production. Mosfilm were the largest and most capable Soviet film studio to take on the project. They started with a selection process to find a director who would be able to helm this gigantic and culturally significant production. There was stiff competition in finding a director, with many of the top and most prominent Soviet directors vying for the position. As a shock to almost everyone, none of the top directors were awarded with this position. Instead, the top job was awarded to a relatively new director called Sergei Bondarchuk. While Sergei Bondarchuk is relatively well known today for directing Waterloo, a film I have covered on this channel, he wasn't very well known for his directing in 60s Russia, as he had only directed one film prior to War and Peace called Fate of a Man, also known as The Destiny of a Man. Bondarchuk was more well known in the Soviet Union for being an actor, which had given him great fame and influence, winning many awards for his acting roles and being quite well known by the Soviet people. Fate of a Man was a huge success in the Soviet Union and helped establish his capability for directing films. The film even won him the prestigious Lenin Prize. Although Fate of a Man helped establish his career in directing, it was a much smaller project compared to what was planned for War and Peace. It came not only as a shock to many others that Bondarchuk had been selected, but also as a surprise to Bondarchuk himself. While it was a surprise, he was also delighted to have been selected to direct such a prestigious film and to uphold the work of Tolstoy and the image of Russia. Although Bondarchuk was selected to direct War and Peace, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for him. There was a general feeling of animosity in Mosfilm and from his peers that Bondarchuk didn't deserve the job to direct War and Peace. Many of his fellow directors didn't accept him and doubted his abilities due to his lack of experience. There was a lot of jealousy and envy towards Bondarchuk, as they felt like they had been snubbed out of a perfect opportunity many had been waiting years for, only for some young and inexperienced upstart director to snatch it away from them. Bondarchuk was generally not very well liked, being seen as a very headstrong and egotistical director from climbing the ladder so fast. He also wasn't a Communist Party member, which most of the best and well-known Soviet directors were. To add to all of that, Bondarchuk was from rural Ukraine, while most Soviet directors came from urban Russia, leaving him to be seen as an outsider, although none of them would ever say that to him in public or to his face out of fear of reprisals. Even with all of his incredulity towards Bondarchuk, it wouldn't stop him or weaken his resolve. Bondarchuk was determined to make a film version of War and Peace that was not only better than the King Vidor version, but was also faithful to Tolstoy's original work and was accurate to the real events. He got to work right away by researching early 19th century Russia and spent a year delving into the time period to give him a better understanding of the history and the context of Tolstoy's novel. After a year of research, Bondarchuk started writing the script for the film, collaborating with Vasily Solovyov, who also has a small part as the Russian artillerist. Bondarchuk wanted to try and adapt as much of Tolstoy's novel as possible, seeing any kind of creative license to War and Peace as unacceptable, stating, "Tolstoy and only Tolstoy, nothing comes from us." Another reason Bondarchuk and Vasily didn't want to take any creative license was because of the Soviet audience. The Soviet audience was the target audience, and pleasing them was a top priority. Mosfilm and Bondarchuk had received hundreds of letters from concerned fans of the original novel, begging Bondarchuk to make an authentic and accurate version and correct the wrongs made by the 1956 version. Bondarchuk knew the Soviet audience was passionate and protective of Tolstoy's works, with War and Peace being highly regarded and beloved by the Soviet people, meaning any deviation away from Tolstoy would not be accepted by the Soviet audience. The audience had a certain preconception of the characters from the novel, which Bondarchuk and Vasily had to take into account when writing the script, as any modern interpretations or Western interpretations of the characters would have been seen as unacceptable. It had to be 100% Tolstoy and 100% Russian. Although it had to be 100% Russian, many Soviet people had seen the 1956 version and had a general idea of how the characters should be displayed and act. Bondarchuk was very wary of making it too similar to the Italian-American version despite the audience's preconceptions. While Bondarchuk and Vasily wanted to keep it as close as possible to the original novel, they had to cut certain sections out and slim others down. Had the film kept everything, it would have been too hard to follow all of the novel's different storylines, and the film would have just been too lengthy. The film was already looking to be just over 7 hours long, and anything much longer would have most likely been unfilmable. Once the script was written and finished, Bondarchuk worked on storyboarding, drawing all of the storyboards himself. He then incorporated them into the shooting script, with the left side of the script depicting the shot and the right side of the script showing how the shot would be framed. Images of paintings were also included in the script to better visualize the scenes. These images were taken from a German book called The Wars of Liberation. Once Bondarchuk and Vasily had finished the script, they moved on to finding filming locations, having props prepared, getting costumes made, and auditioning actors and actresses. All of these tasks were made a lot easier, due in no small part to the film having been commissioned by the Soviet government, receiving its full backing, cooperation, and unlimited state support. While it did have a budget, this budget was often more of an open-ended budget, and if something was needed that wasn't originally accounted for, then it was usually allowed. I will go a little bit more in depth with the budget later, however. Because War and Peace was planned to be a massive production, having many different sets for all of the different scenes, the production required a large amount of props, not only for the sets, but for the actors as well. A lot of those props needed to be made specifically for the film, so the state opened all 58 museums within the USSR to Bondarchuk and his team. This was done so the production team could study the real items and have a reference for making the props. One of the main museums the production team used was the State Historical Museum on Red Square, which has an entire room just dedicated to Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The room has a huge assortment of items, from uniforms and weapons, to paintings, battle positions, and maps. The museum even has one of Napoleon's sleds that he used to escape Russia in the disastrous retreat. The production team used as many of the historical items and materials that were available to them. Not only did the Soviet government open all of the museums, they also let Bondarchuk and his team take any item they wanted from the museums. The museums had to lend out any item they requested without any form of reimbursement. For years, some of these items were on loan while the filming of War and Peace took place. These items were mostly taken to be used as references for the reproduction replicas, with the replicas being made as closely as possible to the real objects. They also used historical design documents for some of the weaponry. Once they had the final designs, they were sent off to multiple factories that started to produce the replicas. Anything and everything was reproduced, from fully fledged muskets, swords, bayonets, and sabers to the tiniest of buttons, belts, buckles, earrings, rings, and necklaces. The production did make a number of muskets, but they couldn't afford to make enough, so they relied on using the Mosin Nagant as a replacement for many of the background extras. It is convincing enough from far away, but in many of the close-up shots you can see soldiers carrying Mosins instead of muskets, starkly standing out with its bolt instead of the flint and frizzen the musket has. They even went as far as to make real Napoleonic-era cannons, with them being constructed like the originals. Supposedly, they were so well made and so accurate to the original cannons that museums even wanted to have them after the film was made so they could exhibit them. Any item that wasn't used as a reference for a reproduction was used as a prop in a scene. Items such as furniture, cutlery, plates, candle holders, paintings, and furnishings were the ones that were mainly used and taken from museums. Along with items, the production team also took historical clothing from the museums. Again, this was for the same reasons they took the items. Since War and Peace was the first Soviet film set at the beginning of the 19th century, they had to make all of the costumes themselves. There was no costumes in storage they could use, and because the film was supposed to be 100% Russian, the government forbade the production from hiring any costumes from Europe. What made the costumes even more challenging was the volume required. The film presents events from 1805 to 1812, and every year the style of clothing changed. Therefore, for every year the film was set in, they had to make a new set of clothing for every character and extra that was featured. This substantially added to the complexity of the production, as there was over 300 speaking parts, and while not all of them were in every year, a good majority were. The costume production was handled by a very talented team of professional seamstresses hand-making the garments. They used historical design documents and real examples to get as close to the original clothing as possible, even using historically accurate textiles that would have been used at the time. The team of seamstresses also helped make thousands of soldiers' uniforms, which totaled to around 3,200 made for the Russians and over 2,000 made for the French, plus over 11,000 shakos, which also had their own ornamentation for each regiment. Every officer of any rank from every regiment featured in the film received a dress uniform and a military uniform. Even all of Napoleon's allies for his invasion of Russia received their own uniforms. Allies such as the Austrians, Prussians, Saxons, Poles, Swiss, Württembergians, Mecklenburgians, Napoleonic Spanish, Italians, Bavarians, Neapolitans, and Danes all had costumes made for them, with each unit and regiment having a detailed design document on their uniforms. Supposedly everyone Napoleon himself listed in his memoirs had an individual uniform made for them. Many of Napoleon's general staff and marshals had individual uniforms made, and they can be seen primarily in the Borodino scenes, a notable example being General Belliard. Much of the work to create the military uniforms was done by over 80 factories owned and operated by the Soviet state. This made the job of making the costumes a little bit easier on the team of seamstresses. When it came to casting actors in the main roles, Bondarchuk struggled heavily. Firstly, when casting the role of Prince Andrei, Bondarchuk cast Inotenki Smostanovsky in the role. While Smostanovsky did eventually accept the role after some back and forth, he had originally wanted the role of Pierre Bezukhov, and when one of Bondarchuk's rivals, Grigory Kozintsev, asked Smostanovsky to play the lead role of Prince Hamlet in his upcoming Hamlet production, Smostanovsky took the opportunity, leaving Bondarchuk without anyone to play Prince Andrei. Bondarchuk then protested to the blatant stealing of his actors to Mosfilm and the government, but Grigory used his connections within Mosfilm and the Ministry of Culture to secure Smostanovsky for his Hamlet production, and there was nothing Bondarchuk could do but find another actor for the role of Prince Andrei. Frustrated and annoyed, Bondarchuk had to cast Vyacheslav Tikhonov as a last resort. He wasn't too fond of Tikhonov, as they had both been acting students together, and Bondarchuk held a low opinion of his acting skills. It didn't matter, however, as time was running out to cast someone as Prince Andrei, and Tikhonov was the only suitable actor for the role, so Bondarchuk begrudgingly cast him, but the two never got along while on and off set. Secondly, finding someone to cast in the role of Pierre Bezukhov was a little bit easier, as Bondarchuk cast himself. Many Soviet actors were furious that Bondarchuk had cast himself in one of the lead roles. The role of Pierre was highly sought after for many actors, not only because it was one of the lead roles for War and Peace, but also because Tolstoy depicts himself as Pierre, and it was a great honor to essentially play a depiction of Tolstoy. Bondarchuk did audition other actors to play the part, but he knew the entire time that he would be the one to play Pierre, even though he was a bit too old to play the character. Thirdly, casting the role of Natasha Rostova was extremely hard, as Bondarchuk wanted to find the perfect girl for the role, one that was naive and unformed like the original novel, and was the very contradiction to the 1956 portrayal by Audrey Hepburn, which Bondarchuk hated. Bondarchuk auditioned over 200 women for the role, and he specifically didn't want to cast any well-known actresses, as he wanted to be able to replicate the character's naivety. He eventually settled on Ludmila Sevelieva, who wasn't an actress at all. She was actually a ballerina from St. Petersburg, known then as Leningrad. She had virtually no acting experience prior to War and Peace, and was surprised when she was chosen for the role. This was great for Bondarchuk, as he knew her naivety would play perfectly into Natasha's character, and Bondarchuk was also able to mold Ludmila into how he wanted her to play the character due to her little acting experience. In my opinion, for her little acting experience, I think she plays the character extremely well. Outside of the three main roles, there was also hundreds of minor roles. Some were more prominent than others, but regardless, these all still had to be cast, and there were hundreds of actors auditioning for each role, many of them coming from various theatres across the Soviet Union. In the end, the cast grew to around 300 speaking roles, and that doesn't even include all of the background extras that had no speaking part and were merely just there to populate the scene. These extras came from all walks of life, from professors and government officials to actors and students. Bondarchuk was very particular about every speaking role, however, wanting to cast an actor that looked like the real person they were portraying, even if that person only appeared for a brief scene. Notable examples of Bondarchuk's meticulous nature regarding characters are Julie Jokanalidze as Prince Bagration and Boris Akava as Mikhail Kutuzov. Both of them look extremely similar to their real-life counterparts, especially when they're all dressed up and have their hair and makeup done. Bondarchuk was extremely committed to having his actors look like the real historical figures. He even got permission from the Soviet government to fly out hairdressers and stylists from Paris in order to replicate the styles of the Napoleonic times. Along with bringing in hairdressers and stylists, they also used reproduction portraits from the time to get accurate portrayals of the hair and makeup used. Illustrations Tolstoy also found appropriate were used for the same purpose. Bondarchuk would also carry these techniques over to his later film Waterloo, which was another massive Napoleonic War epic. While all of that pre-production was going on, thousands of paintings were being made by the art direction studio attached to the film to plan the settings. Landscapes along with the Russian towns and villages were also sketched. They used these paintings as a guide to the color palette for the film. Location scouts were hard at work for months finding the right filming locations. Bondarchuk wanted to shoot the majority of the film on location, which was rather unusual for Soviet films as they were mostly shot on sound stages. Upon completion of the location scouting, the film crew started filming in 1962. Bondarchuk and his team also had permission from the Soviet government to shoot in virtually any location they wanted. This permission went so far that Bondarchuk was able to even shoot scenes in the Kremlin and on Red Square. While filming on Red Square, the production team was able to transform the square back to how it looked in the early 19th century. Bondarchuk always preferred shooting on location and wanted to try and shoot as much of the film on location as possible. Another one of the real locations Bondarchuk used was for the scene where the French soldiers execute suspected arsonists. This was actually filmed next to the walls of the Novodichi convent, where the real events took place. When it came to the burning of Moscow, Bondarchuk obviously couldn't film the burning of Moscow in Moscow, so instead he had a replica set of old Moscow made for the burning. The replica set was designed from historical paintings and sketches done by production designers Mikhail Bogdanov and Gennady Myasnikov. It took over 4 months of hard labor to build the set, only for it to be burnt down in a day. The set was rather large and was built near the small village of Teryevo, which is just outside of Moscow. Cinematographer Anatoly Petritsky had a large length of track built on the set for the cameras. This was done so the cameras could capture a constant sense of motion through the chaos and confusion of the fires, making the scene more real and frightful. Before they could burn down the set, they had to set strict fire safety rules, and the pyrotechnics prepared for over 4 hours, making sure everything was right, as one slip-up could cause a serious accident. There was 3 Soviet fire trucks on hand just in case the fire got out of control. Unsurprisingly, for the scale of the burning, it got out of control once, when the winds picked up and blew the fire towards the nearby village. Fortunately, the experienced firefighters on hand were able to control the fire and no one was hurt or injured. The set also suffered minimal unintended damage. In order to capture the scenes, the cameramen had to wear special fire protective suits to avoid getting burnt while working so close to the fire. The whole sequence was a massive risk to the crew and the extras as they had to run right next to the scorching flames with little protection. Bondarchuk himself had to do this as he didn't use stand-ins or stunt doubles. He did everything himself, and that goes for all of his scenes, not just the burning of Moscow. I find it astonishing that no one caught serious burns or died. Outside of the fear for the safety of the cast and crew, there was a real worry of failing to capture the right footage. If the set burnt down and they didn't get what they wanted, they would have to spend months rebuilding the set from scratch. Combine that with the huge material cost and the labor involved, it could have easily turned into a disaster for the production. It was one of the more harebrained ideas Bondarchuk had while filming War and Peace, but what he was able to pull off is nothing short of impressive in my opinion. Bondarchuk was able to bring to life this horrific event with vivid detail, depicting the chaotic nature of the event that engulfed 2/3 of the city in flames. It's a raw and unfiltered recreation of events, using practical fire to great effect. Bondarchuk couldn't shoot every scene on location. He still had to shoot a good chunk of the film on sound stages at Mosfilm. 7 out of the 13 sound stages at Mosfilm were being used at the same time for War and Peace, and these sound stages housed a number of different sets. The biggest of these sets was the ballroom that Natasha has her dance with Prince Andrei in. The set was over 1,000 square meters and was designed after real 19th century ballrooms. The set also features 4 large chandeliers, and the art direction studio had to sketch up 37 different designs for the chandeliers in preparation for the ballroom. A cast of over 500 extras was assembled to populate the set. The ballroom also had towers built into the top of the set so they could shoot the extras dancing from an overhead angle. Initially, Bondarchuk and Petritsky had a hard time trying to capture the extras dancing from ground level, so instead they had a cameraman skate around on roller skates to more gracefully capture the dancers. The idea for the roller skates actually came from Petritsky's son. Bondarchuk flashed different coloured fans in front of the camera to change focus quickly, and to also make it look like the camera was actually in the dance, passing between people. The Battle of Borodino is the biggest of the 4 battles presented in the film. It is a key scene that marks Russia's stubborn and defiant stand against Napoleon's invasion. The battle was also one of the bloodiest, resulting in over 70,000 deaths in one day. Bondarchuk was adamant to get it right, so he started to get some inspiration from Franz Roubaud's huge painting of the Battle of Borodino. Originally, Bondarchuk wanted to shoot on the actual fields the Battle of Borodino took place on. However, this idea had to be abandoned early on, as the actual battlefield is covered in monuments dedicated to the battle, making the site unusable as a filming location. Since Bondarchuk couldn't use the real battlefield of Borodino, he shifted locations to Dragobush, Russia. The location scouts were able to find a suitable field to house the planned battle. The production team then got a group of Soviet engineers to terraform the landscape to somewhat resemble the battlefield landscape of Borodino, along with creating the 2 main earthworks the real battlefield had. those two being the Fletchers and the Great Redoubt. They also created some other minor earthworks, a small village, laid down dirt roads, and strewed the battlefield with fake corpses of horses and men along with broken down carts and artillery pieces. Hundreds of miles of track was laid down for the camera on the battlefield set, so Petritsky could capture all of the action that was unfolding around them. He wanted to take the audience through all of the fire and explosions to get as close as possible to what it would have really been like for a soldier fighting during the battle. Once that was all in place, they brought in a huge number of Soviet Red Army extras that were provided to them by the Soviet military, totaling to around 15,000 extras for the shooting of the Borodino scenes. It was the most extras they had on set at one time, and it was a huge undertaking, taking weeks of rehearsals for every shot. Trying to manage the many soldiers and ensuring that they got to set and in position was a nightmare for the production team. The team also had to worry about all the special effects required for each scene. Messing up could cause weeks of delays trying to get the set back in order and all of the soldiers back to their original positions. Bondarchuk and Petritsky would spend every night before the next day of shooting discussing what they would do next. Vladimir Likachev, who was the special effects technician and was responsible for all of the fire, explosions, and smoke, would spend days getting all of the special effects ready for one shot. Bondarchuk wanted to focus on showing the magnitude of the battle. Since he was a World War II veteran and he knew what war was really like, he wanted to bring the horror of war to life. To capture as much of the action as possible, Bondarchuk and Petritsky employed as many techniques with the cameras as possible, using automatic cameras with remote controls for locations they couldn't reach. They used helicopters to capture aerial shots of the battlefield. Petritsky also invented the flying camera, which was essentially a camera put in a box that moved downwards on two wires. It was used in the scene where the Russians recaptured the earthworks, and it took Petritsky almost 2 weeks to master the flying camera, as the wires would often snap or burn off from the fire. But finally, after many tries, the camera worked, and here is the final result. The work paid off, and it is one of the more creative scenes in the film. Even though the film has plenty of great camera work, this scene always stood out to me. The other battle scenes were shot in Ukraine, where there was large open fields that could be used for the intended battlefield sets. Small parts were also shot in the Caucasus. These other battle scenes would feature a lot less extras, cutting the total down to around 5,000 to 6,000. While this is still an impressive number for any film, these other battle scenes were a lot shorter and thus didn't require as many extras. The production was able to get this many Red Army extras because the film was fully state-backed, and the Ministry of Defense assigned 6 top-ranking generals to help the production team coordinate all of the soldiers. The soldiers were conscripted into working on the film, with them being ordered to participate as part of their military duty to the country. The soldiers were also not paid for their time while on set, drastically decreasing the film's budget. Before filming with the soldiers could begin, they needed to be trained in Napoleonic drill. The production team used old French and Napoleonic drill manuals. They were then trained for over 7 weeks before they had fully mastered the Napoleonic drill. The production team also trained the soldiers to march at the correct pace, having the soldiers portraying the Russians march at 75 steps per minute, while they had the soldiers portraying the French march at 125 steps per minute. That training appears to have paid off as it shows in the film, with the soldiers being able to march in good order, keeping in formation and not breaking up for the majority of the time. You can even see some soldiers looking to their sides to try and see if they are still in formation. Once the training was completed, they could begin filming with the soldiers. The soldiers were only supposed to be on set for 2 to 3 weeks of filming, but due to the delays and complications, most were retained for upwards of 3 months. The production team housed the mini-army in a tent city that would often be right next to the set or just a couple of miles away. The soldiers still lived a military life while off set, and they lived off army rations. Every day the soldiers were on set, they would either march or be picked up by army trucks, then given a costume for whatever side they were going to portray, and then told their positions for whatever scene Bondarchuk was shooting. Bondarchuk and the generals would be set up in a massive tower overlooking the battlefield set, and would direct the soldiers into positions via walkie-talkies and megaphones. The officers of the unit would then relay the orders to his troops, and the cameras would start rolling. Another job many Soviet soldiers had outside of the battle scenes was serving as stagehands on the studio sets. Napoleonic warfare featured cavalry heavily, but with the advancements in technology over time, cavalry had become obsolete, and by the 60s, the Soviet Union had disbanded all of their military cavalry regiments. This was a big problem for Bondarchuk, especially during Borodino, where the cavalry played a large role in the actual battle. To solve this problem, the state enlisted the help of the Moscow police, which had a mounted detachment, along with units of horse-drawn mounted artillery from the northern Caucasus, Turkestan, and the Baltic regions. This wasn't enough for the film, however, and the state specially raised the 11th Separate Cavalry Regiment for filming purposes. This regiment was first used on War and Peace, and would later be used on Waterloo and many other films. The cavalrymen were given 7 different uniforms during filming. They were the Polish Lancers, French and Russian Hussars, French and Russian Cuirassiers, French Dragoons, and Cossacks. The Soviet Air Force was also roped in to help, providing helicopters and planes that were mostly used for getting aerial shots of the battlefield scenes. They were also used for the scenes of the French retreat during the Russian winter. The Air Force was not reimbursed for the use of helicopters, planes, pilots, and fuel. Now, when it comes to the budget of War and Peace, its true size has been under speculation for many years. As mentioned before, the budget for War and Peace would change a number of times and was more open-ended than a real set amount. This was because of the constant delays and problems the production had, the true cost of which is hard to calculate, since many of the elements of the production, like the use of the Soviet military, were never accounted for in the budget. There are many numbers floating around, with many different sources claiming different estimates. However, modern estimates put the film's total budget to being around 700 million to $1 billion in today's money, making it the most expensive Russian film ever made, along with one of the most expensive films ever made. Even foregoing inflation adjustments, it still remains the most expensive Russian film ever made. In 1965, the first 2 parts of the film were completed under a hasty schedule and premiered in the Moscow Kremlin Palace of Congresses to great acclaim. However, filming was still ongoing for the last 2 parts and would continue well into 1966, with the last 2 parts eventually being released in late 1967. It took over 4 years to finish the film, and with a production of this size, it was bound to run into some problems. One of the main problems that set the production back was the poor Soviet film stock that was used. Bondarchuk begged the Soviet government to allow him to use Kodak film stock, since it was superior to Soviet film stock, but the state refused, citing that this film was to be 100% Soviet, therefore must use Soviet film stock. This caused huge problems, as the poorer film stock often had stripes on the film, with it frequently deteriorating and corroding before Bondarchuk was even able to look at it. This would cause the production to be set back weeks, as they would have to go back and recreate entire scenes because of the unusable film stock. Eventually, it got so frustrating for Bondarchuk to go back and redo the scenes that he just opted to do 8 to 10 takes of every scene to make sure he had backups. This not only took a toll on Bondarchuk, but his actors as well, who would have to do take after take after take. Bondarchuk's meticulous nature, combined with this, often bordered on bullying his actors into getting everything right, take after take. Ludmila in particular was so scared of Bondarchuk because of how stern he was. Management and logistics also played a massive role in slowing down the filming, which was to be expected for a production of this size, but as Bondarchuk was a perfectionist, it didn't help either. Always wanting everything to be just right, cast members would often have to spend hours sitting around just waiting for Bondarchuk. The theatre scene, for example, is a small scene that took days to complete because of Bondarchuk's methods. This was one of the many issues that plagued the production. The production team also had to deal with bad cameras and lights that would spontaneously break without any warning. There was also never any parts to replace them, leaving them unable to film for days as new parts needed to be made and delivered. The lights would often be too light or too dark at times, with them needing to be constantly adjusted. Sometimes it would get so hot that it would melt the makeup off the actors' and actresses' faces. Bondarchuk had problems working with people as well. 3 different cinematographers quit on him, one of them quitting before filming had even started due to disputes over cinematography direction. One of the production designers quit on him, and one of the film editors also left the production. Bondarchuk didn't get much sympathy from Mosfilm either, as they were quite ambivalent to the film and didn't have much faith in him. Some of the producers were downright hostile to Bondarchuk while filming. Luckily, Bondarchuk never faced too many problems with the Soviet government, who were more than happy to help as long as that help was coming from a Soviet place. Surprisingly for the time, Bondarchuk faced little censorship. Scenes like the one where the Russian Orthodox priests are parading Our Lady of Smolensk before the Russian troops at Borodino were not cut, removed, or censored in any way, and it's an extremely powerful scene that you would have never seen under Stalin. Even though the Soviet Union was an atheist state and Khrushchev had harsh anti-religious policies against the Russian Orthodox Church, there was no attempt to censor it, or at least there was no attempt that we know about. With all of the complications and problems Bondarchuk faced, he never gave up and always pushed past everything to see his vision of Tolstoy's work presented in what he deemed an appropriate fashion. He knew that War and Peace had to be this grandiose epic, as it would have been impossible to try and make War and Peace with only a couple of characters and scenes. It just wouldn't work. Bondarchuk certainly succeeded in absolutely obliterating the 1956 version in every single way. I can say with confidence that Bondarchuk's version is the definitive version of War and Peace, and no version since has been able to match it. When it released, it was extremely popular, with over 60 million Soviet people watching the first two parts, double the 1956 version. It was also very well received by the Soviet audience, with most of them being impressed by the film and the interpretation of the characters. Sadly, by the time Part 3 and 4 had come out, people had lost interest and it wasn't as popular as the first two parts. But it was very popular in France and Japan. It even won an Oscar for the Best Foreign Language Film in 1969.
Russia for War and Peace.
Being the first Soviet film to do so, it was also the first time the Soviet film industry was on par with Hollywood, and it certainly showed the West that they had the power to produce a film to that level. While Bondarchuk won great praise for his work, the production almost killed Bondarchuk on a number of occasions, and it had a terrible effect on his physical and mental health, irreversibly changing him. Directing, acting, and writing War and Peace had put so much stress on his body he was never the same after finishing the film. Although it almost destroyed him, Bondarchuk and his team of countless people managed to create what I consider to be one of cinema's greatest achievements. The fact that it is all real shows the power that cinema has to be able to create. There are many epics that also have insane productions, but I personally don't think anything comes close to War and Peace. Part 3 with its Battle of Borodino segment could be its own film, yet it's only one of 4 parts of this film, just to put that into perspective. Even a film like Waterloo, which I have referenced many times and was also directed by Bondarchuk, only goes so far compared to War and Peace. A film like War and Peace is a one of a kind, and it would have never been made if it wasn't for the huge support from the Soviet government and military. Bondarchuk stated himself that it would have been impossible to create such a film without the armed forces. The immense amount of effort from every single person involved is what made War and Peace possible. If you would like to view this once-in-a-lifetime experience, I highly recommend checking it out on Mozfilm's YouTube channel, where you can view it fully in its original 4 parts. If you have made it this far, thank you for watching. This video took forever just due to how massive this film is. There was just so much that went into making this film. It's staggering to say the least.